Dauntless. It's no secret that Dauntless as a faction was definitely one of the coolest factions that we were introduced to in the world of Divergent. My first impressions of Dauntless was that they were sort of like the popular kids of the Divergent world. They were bold and fierce and didn't seem to care. You couldn't help but admire how bold and fearless they were. However, personally for me, jumping into a train as part of your initiation is a no. Thank you very much. I knew Dauntless was never going to be for me. I cannot run that far. No, thank you. No, thank you, girl. However, I completely understand why Triss would be attracted to such a faction. And yet, despite this being one of the coolest factions, Dauntless had a considerable amount of problems within its faction and within its build and its manifesto. In fact, one of my great subscribers had put the words in my mouth directly, saying that Dauntless was full of bullies. And I could not help but agree. However, before I diverge, see what I did there, period, into all of the problems that are part of the Dauntless faction, let's start from the beginning. So what does being dauntless mean? The word dauntless means to show fearlessness and determination. In my previous videos, I also explained the origin of the factions as quoted by Triss in the book. For a more extensive history, you can see my last video, but in short, the elders who believed that the warring world could be explained by personalities and split society into groups accordingly, those that created Dauntless blamed cowardice as the reason. They believed the only answer was to face your fears through bravery. Without hesitation, any Dauntless member would say that what they value most is courage. However, it is when the word courage is defined that they begin to disagree with one another. One subset of Dauntless would define courage as fearlessness, and that means to eradicate fear in all its forms amongst its members. Another subset would define courage as simply boldness and emphasize action in spite of fear rather than the elimination of fear itself. This difference, even though it is minor, often leads to a lot of conflict among the Dauntless members, particularly in the area of initiation. You can already see here that this is one of the biggest problems within Dauntless as a faction, but I'll delve into that in just 1 second. Common to all Dauntless is a commitment to bravery that supersedes all other considerations, including safety, the opinion of others, and sometimes peace itself. Now, why do I bring up the different types of definitions of courage in Dauntless is because this is a fundamental part to why this faction was extremely flawed, and it was easy for it to break apart and be a useful tool to erudite. I constantly think of Dauntless as the police force of the world in Divergent, and this is also mirrored and said by different characters in the book as well. As a result, they emphasize action rather than thought and sort of leave the thinking to erudite. For those who define courage as fearlessness, as I said previously, seek to eradicate fear in all its forms among its members. This also means, however, that they emphasize fearlessness through advocating for harsher and more extreme methods of training, eradicating fear by performing more and more reckless acts. Members who wanted this type of faction were people like Eric, who advocated for this version of Dauntless, whereas the other subset of Dauntless people stuck more to the original core beliefs of the Dauntless faction, seeing courage as boldness, or otherwise known as fear under control, by standing up and doing things in spite of fear. This subset of Dauntless members were generally less extreme and did not emphasize the same amount of harshness during their training. In fact, these Dauntless members called the fearless subset and their methods cruelty and bullying. And I actually agree, which is why you see sometimes that Dauntless members do feel like bullies, especially in the main Divergent series. But in the book 4, you were able to see what Dauntless was like before the new era and wave of methods used to train initiates in Dauntless, aka pre-Eric. Now, this in itself is a problem. In my personal opinion, this division acted as a precursor to future conflicts within the faction that we would eventually see. Because of the fact that Dauntless, despite priding themselves on physical agility and strength, neglected the importance of emotional agility outside of the realm of fear. This led them to be vulnerable to external threats and eventual internal corruption, showcasing the limitations of their focus solely on fearlessness. Because they have no reverence for logical thinking and emotional intelligence, which I'll get to in a second, it's easy to see why their faction became so corrupt so quickly. When you are in a group that emphasizes action over thought and action over mind, you're bound to get reckless thoughts with no direction. Couple that with their dependency on technology from erudite, and you can see why these two were a deadly duo that oppressed the rest of the factions. We can also understand Dauntless more by looking at their manifesto. And yet, even in the same manifesto, you can already see conflict, as it says that they believe that justice is more important than peace. This leads to the second problem, that Dauntless does not have the emotional tact and logical understanding to officiate justice in such a way that does not wreak havoc on everyone else. Dauntless's version of justice seems more like revenge a lot of the time than justice itself. Couple that with the fact that this is a faction that believes that justice, aka revenge, is more important than peace, you're bound to see problems everywhere you go. Now, I think it's interesting that the faction that Dauntless is not getting along with the most is Amity, who tends to focus on peace above everything else. Dauntless people call people who are in Amity cowards, which is a bold move on its own, but to some degree I do understand it, because Amity goes out of its way to avoid conflict. They do this so much that they actively drug people in their bread with a sort of serum to keep them at peace, so therefore there needs to be no conflict within the faction, which puts Dauntless and Amity in extremes with one another. It's so sad that both of them could not see the power in each other's strengths. Imagine if Amity was able to use the fearlessness of Dauntless to be physically brave and not just feel conflict, but also recognize that conflict could be used in human growth and vice versa. With Dauntless, for them to recognize that kindness has a really important place in humanity and not everything has to be solved with physical violence. But alas, that is not how this world is built, which goes into my third point, neglecting emotional bravery. Now, I bring up emotional courage because, again, Dauntless emphasizes its idea of fearlessness and bravery and courage, yet seemingly forgets and negates the importance of emotional bravery outside of fear. Emotional courage is the ability to be able to feel fear and sadness, but do what you can despite those feelings. And for a lot of people on this earth, emotional bravery is harder than that of physical courage. Most likely, a lot of people are willing to put themselves in physically dangerous situations than to face their emotional traumas, issues, and problems. That in itself is a superior form of bravery. Now, this is not to say that we do not need physical bravery, of course, but the fact that this is so ignored tells me that their performance of bravery and fearlessness is sometimes really a facade. You can see in this faction that these members would rather put their life on the line by jumping from building to building, ziplining from one area to the other in extremely risky situations, than be emotionally vulnerable. This leads to a culture where one can not only be able to fully express themselves, as that is with other factions of course, but it also leads to a lot of stifling and bullying. One thing that also really gets to me about the Dauntless is how they sort of bully one another on points that make no logical sense. For example, in the book Insurgent, when everyone is in the Candor headquarters, Four and Trist are given the truth serum. With this truth serum, Four has to admit the fact that he only chose Dauntless because he actively wanted to escape his abusive father's household. And yet, despite having to share this information and that being scary on its own, there are some Dauntless members afterwards who decided to call him a coward, and they actively said this to his face in the cafeteria. And it is not until he has to physically beat his own father, essentially taking on the same position and the same way that his father used to beat him, was he finally able to be seen as brave in front of his fellow faction, which is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. The fact that you escaped your abuser is not seen as brave is just alarming to me, and it shows you that Dauntless only chooses to see the physical side of bravery, not the emotional side, and they have absolutely no emotional intelligence within that faction. Sorry, not sorry. Which leads me to my other point. Dauntless's emphasis on bravery borderlines on recklessness. Sometimes the actions taken by Dauntless members are not necessarily brave, but they're actually just stupidly reckless. A lot of the times, Dauntless members have to show the fact that they're willing to take on new risks by putting themselves in actual physical danger, which, I mean, you can argue if you were on the police force, that is something you naturally have to do, but at least on the police force, there's recognition to some degree that you can't just put yourself in a reckless situation when you can avoid it. But Dauntless members seem to actively want to search for reckless situations to give them more adrenaline. My final point is on the tragic tale of elder suicides in Dauntless. So while I was reading the books, especially I started with 4 rather than Divergent, I wanted to see another point of view from the first book. And 4, while he was sitting with his fellow members, at some point the fellow members reflect on how there are no elders in the faction of Dauntless. This is also mentioned in the book Insurgent as well, as to how a lot of older people in Dauntless will tend to throw themselves off buildings or commit suicide because they cannot simply handle the fact that they are older and their bodies do not have as much physical agility as they once did. Not being able to handle this and being in such a faction that values youth, they would rather take themselves out than, well, be factionless. This in itself is horrifying. The fact that there are less elders in Dauntless really shows in how they move as a faction, because they're losing a potential loss of wisdom as a consequence. Even with Dauntless leaders tend to be extremely young. Now, I'm not saying that wisdom cannot come within young people, as we can see in society that it's not all the time that age comes with wisdom, but I think that they're losing potential tact and political understanding by not having elders in their society who've seen things for a longer amount of time. I personally believe that if they had older people, at least some in the ranks, Dauntless members could be shaped to be able to be smarter, to understand that violence is not necessarily required in every situation and can actually be avoided for not only the peace of society, but for their own selves. That in itself is not fear. That in itself is intelligence. But if you don't have anybody who's really older who can teach you or give you wisdom, how can you expect to have any sort of intelligence in your faction? I also think that the elder suicides have a psychological impact on their children. I cannot imagine just how much fear and anxiety that would definitely cause within the faction members and their children themselves. The fact that you never know if your parents might decide to take the jump is quite scary, and can also make you scared to want to grow older or see the beauty in life while you're aging. Even when the characters in the book talk about these elder suicides, you only see in a split second how they show emotion. A lot of members refuse to cry or find a healthy way to express that kind of pain and anguish. As somebody who is quite emotional herself, it absolutely bothers me. Even the romances of Dauntless members are very hot-tempered. I've also noticed that quite a lot of the characters will simply refuse to make logical decisions or decisions that require more afterthought because it's deemed as not Dauntless and more of an erudite quality. And this is of course commentary on the whole Divergent system as a whole, but I find it so hard to believe that people will only choose to think one specific way for the rest of their lives and not be able to take a step back and think in a different direction for once. I think, and this is just for all the factions, that the faction system really underestimates the complexity of human nature as a whole. And it's one of the reasons why the Divergent series sometimes is so flawed. But yes, these are just my thoughts. So you guys can let me know down in the comments below how y'all feel. I just wanted to come here and give my 2 cents. I'm still currently reading the books, and you guys will definitely receive an unhinged recap of the book 4 because I have so much to say. So look out for that in a week or 2. Anyways, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see y'all later. Okay, bye.